Good morning. Great to see everyone. And we are talking about moral theory. We've talked about consequentialism. We've talked about deontic ethics. And we started having a conversation about virtue ethics. And this is the last of 3 lectures on virtue ethics. And we began with Confucius and Aristotle. Then we talked about Epicureanism and cynicism and Stoicism. Today, we're going to be looking at contemporary approaches to virtue theory. Yes, people still are talking about virtue theory. It is not simply a relic of antiquity. People have revived these theories and amended and developed these theories in new ways. And this is still a very influential part of contemporary ethical philosophy. Yes, people still take virtue theory very seriously and are still working out ways to adapt virtue theory to our contemporary problems. And Jazz, it's good to see you.
Good to see you too, Professor.
Great. Okay, so the last in our 3 lecture series on virtue theory, contemporary approaches. What are people doing today? Well, what is contemporary virtue ethics? And we have a pretty good understanding. I mean, we've looked at virtue ethics from, Confucianism and Aristotelianism and Stoicism and all of that. So contemporary virtue theory is a family of moral theories, again, not surprisingly, that looks at character as the center of ethical evaluations. So we're not really concerned with rules per se, or our duty, or consequences. We're not trying to maximize utility or happiness, right? Or pleasure over pain. We're thinking about character, our character. What is our character like? So here we're going to be drawing from the ancients. We're going to be looking at Aristotle and drawing from Aristotle. So contemporary virtue theorists argue that ethics is about human flourishing. Think about that. Like, what is the point of all of this? Really, what is the point of being good? What is the point of, creating a good society? It is about what makes people flourish, people living in communities. How do they get along? How do they flourish? How do we live the best life we can live? So we think about virtues like honesty and courage and justice and compassion. Why are these things important? They enable us to live well within a community with other people. And because we know that we are social beings, and again, we're taking that idea from Aristotle, we are social animals. And so we need other people. We need them to cooperate with us. And we also need them for our own sense of personal well being. And so, yeah, the virtues are central. So again, we're not looking at rules or maxims or principles or the hedonic calculus or anything like that. We're simply saying, hey, what does it take to lead a good life? And what character virtues should we focus on to live a life of human flourishing? And so themes in contemporary virtue ethics, what are the themes that we're looking at? And so, not surprisingly, character matters more than rules. Like rules, I think rules are important, but what is more important is character. So morality primarily is concerned with the character of the agent, not just the rightness of actions. Okay, so yeah, it's important that we do the right thing, but what is more important is that we're trying to do the right thing, that we're a good person, right? So actions are understood as expressions of stable dispositions, virtues and vices, rather than as isolated choices governed by external rules. Look, we can develop systems of rules that we can follow, but if we're not good people, it doesn't really matter. Okay. So here, right, intentions do matter. So the Kantians are onto something, right? Our intentions are more important because our intentions reveal what our character is like. And so, yes, we'll come up with rules, but those systems of rules will be imperfect. So what we should focus on is developing our character, right? Now, the whole point of this virtue ethics is human flourishing. And here, again, we're going to borrow an idea from Aristotle, eudaimonia. Eudaimonia. What a great word that is. Sometimes it's translated as happiness, but when we use the English word happiness, I think that too many people associate that with just pleasure. And of course, pleasure is a part of a good life, but it's not the whole story. Pleasure isn't the whole story. There are other considerations that need to be developed in order to be fully human. And so, what conditions need to be present to allow people to develop in a way that they can flourish, right? So virtues are defined by their role in enabling a good life. That's the whole point, that we all live the best possible type of life. A life marked by flourishing, fulfillment, well-being. And there's a lot of different ways to conceptualize this or to conceive it. There's no simple formula here. A lot of it is going to come down to trial and error, but moral norms should be grounded in what it means to live well and the kind of being we are, rather than in some abstract idea of moral life. So what we should do here is rooted in what we are. And again, going back to that natural law idea, that it does matter what we are. Remember that David Hume, the philosopher, had this is-ought distinction, that we can't go from what is to what ought to be. Well, from the position of virtue ethics, that isn't the case. We have to learn what we are and what makes us happy. And then when we learn that, we will have a roadmap to a good society. Now, importantly, and you see that this was completely missing in Kant, the idea of moral emotions, right? Emotions aren't ancillary. They aren't obstacles to reason. They aren't antagonists to reason. They can be developed to track moral reality appropriately, right? Fear in courage, anger in justice, compassion in care ethics. Emotions play a role in our life, and we can't ignore our emotions. We can't relegate them to the sidelines. Emotions motivate us to behave, to act. And so we need to harness those emotions in service of something that is good. And so the role of moral emotions is a major theme for contemporary virtue ethics. Also, the role of society, social practice. For contemporary virtue ethics, virtues are shaped within social practices, social roles, traditions. And here we go back to Confucius, right? We are not isolated individuals. We develop in the context of families. of friendships, of communities. And there must be harmony within those social organizations for us to develop adequately. And so moral agency is embedded, it's narrative, it's historically situated. It's not purely in the individual doesn't exist in a vacuum. The individual exists in a context, a historical context, a social context. So here, we don't want to fall into relativism. We want to avoid that. However, we must acknowledge that virtues, genuine virtues, may be expressed differently across cultures and practices. So there's not one way to human flourishing. There's not one way to a good society or a good life. But there is a distinction between human flourish, societies that flourish and societies that fail, right? We know that. But there's not one recipe on how to do that. All right. Among contemporary virtue theorists, there are different approaches to what virtue is. But these approaches or interpretations are not honestly all that distinct from one another. However, for the purpose of organization, I find this is probably the best approach to talk about the subject is to divide this topic into these four different approaches. Now, there are the Neo-Aristotelians. For the Neo-Aristotelians, virtue is rooted in human nature and enables human flourishing. There are the capacity-based virtue theorists, and here human flourishing is a major consideration. But there's also the recognition that if we don't really talk about development and capacity, then we can never really get to human flourishing. So there's a different emphasis. There's agent-based virtue ethics, and here virtues depend on the inner motivation of the agent. Finally, we have contemporary Confucian virtue ethics. And contemporary Confucian virtue ethics reinterprets the teachings of Confucius or Master Kong for a modern context and looks at the teachings of Confucius in a more comprehensive way. And so again, there aren't really that many differences or significant differences between these four different approaches to virtue ethics, but there are kind of minor changes in emphasis. Okay, the Neo-Aristotelians. Here we have Alistair MacIntyre, Elizabeth Anscombe, and Philippa Foot. Okay, so these are our three Neo-Aristotelians. And the core idea here is what does it take for humans to flourish? Like, what kind of society do we have to live in for human beings to really achieve happiness, right? And let's start with Foot. Philippa Foot. Now, Foot is a very interesting philosopher. She's very famous. She came up with the trolley example when we talked about utilitarianism and thinking about the limits of utilitarianism and that very famous trolley example. Well, what is morality for Foot? Foot says that morality is grounded in the facts of what we are, who we are. We have to understand what human beings are. Then we will know what human beings should do. So virtues for foot are those traits necessary for human beings to flourish. Moral judgments, therefore, are objective. Why? Because there's an objective sense of human nature. All humans are the same. We live in different environmental context and historical conditions, but human beings basically the same. We all need the same things to lead a good life. We all get sick. We all are afraid of dying. We all face conflicts and environmental challenges. And so we have to figure out what does it take for human beings to flourish. And we can actually answer those questions, and the traits that are necessary for human flourishing, we refer to as virtues. So, like Aristotle, Foote emphasized virtue as our a human's natural excellences. Now, for Foote, morality is about what is actually good, not commandments, not our feelings, not the maxim of utility, not the categorical imperative, right? We have to focus on what is actually good. So we're going to have to look at the world. We're going to have to look like Aristotle. We're going to have to look at human societies and figure out what do humans do that is actually good. And so moral judgments turn out to be factual judgments. And I love that, right? Moral judgments are just factual judgments about what is good for humans to do, like what culminates or what promotes human flourishing. Like there are some actions that help us live a good life, and there are some things that we could do that hinder that. And that's an objective reality that is rooted in human nature. That is rooted in our identity as human beings, right? And so we can identify the things that are good and the things that help us flourish and the things that aren't. So ultimately, she says no to Kantianism. That doesn't make any sense. I mean, that this idea of a categorical imperative that fits every situation, that's not going to work. That's too inflexible. Also, utilitarianism and emotivism. Emotivism is the view that morality simply is what we feel, right? Like think of the boo hurrah theory of morality, right? It's like when I say that something is good, I mean that I like it. When I say that something is bad, it means I don't like it. So she rejects that, of course. Instead, she grounds ethics in natural facts about human beings, our needs, our vulnerabilities, and how we live. So virtues are indispensable. Moral evaluations are based on facts of how humans live. What traits help humans live a good life? So we could look at an oak tree and we could say, look, what is good for an oak tree to have? Well, and without strong roots, the oak tree won't flourish. Without, adequate sunlight, the oak tree won't flourish. Without adequate nutrients in the soil and adequate water, the oak tree won't flourish. So all of these things are virtues for the oak tree. So we can say the same thing about human beings. There are just certain characteristics that contribute to a good human life. So justice, temperance, courage, benevolence, these are indispensable for a species like ours, a social species. Without these things, it's not possible for humans to live a good life, just like without strong roots or without enough water. a tree will die. So moral judgments are derived from, or the virtues are derived from, facts about human existence. Now, the trolley problem, and this is great. We talked about the trolley problem, and all of you guys have heard about the trolley problem. And we understand this is a great way to understand utilitarianism, both its advantages and liabilities. So the out of control trolley is going down the railway tracks and 5 people will be killed, but you can press a button and the trolley will be diverted down a railway siding and only 1 person will die. Now, from the utilitarian point of view, this is just a math problem. You could save 5 people by sacrificing 1 person, and that makes sense intuitively, doesn't it? But Foote says this is a more complicated problem than it seems. Because what if I asked you not to press a button, but to push someone in front of the trolley car? You can save 5 people by pushing somebody onto the track and stopping the trolley car. Would you do that? Do you see how the problem changes? So context matters, right? And the distinction between killing and allowing someone to die is morally meaningful. So utilitarianism is a bit simplistic, isn't it? Like real moral situations don't reveal themselves to have simple calculative answers. Moral responsibility is a complicated and nuanced issue. And the utilitarians just get it wrong by trying to reduce the complexity of these moral issues to a formula. Formulas aren't going to work. And the same could be true for deontology, right? That's just not going to work. It's too simplistic a solution. Also, morality is just one consideration, right? It's not overriding. It's not the most important. I mean, it is important, but it's not the only thing that matters. Morality is only one domain of practical reasoning among others. It's not the only way. It's not a sovereign authority that overrides all competing considerations in the way that Kant imagined morality to be. Moral norms are important, of course, but they arise from human needs, social cooperation, and the virtues necessary for flourishing, not from some external moral law. Look, when we make moral systems, we're just trying to figure out a way to make society work and to allow more people to be happy. There's no external moral law that automatically binds us regardless of the cost. So yeah, morality is important, but it's not overriding. Now, Elizabeth Anscombe, also an important philosopher in virtue theory, and Anscombe was very critical of both utilitarianism and deontic ethics and said, look, these theories are just incoherent. These theories are just incoherent. This is a theme with virtue theorists, right? They're going to attack the utilitarians. They're going to attack Kantianism. So Anscombe said, like these utilitarianism and deontic ethics are incoherent. So we have to start over with new assumptions. And we have to build ethics around human virtues and a framework of human flourishing rather than a law-like structure of right and wrong. Okay, so all of these virtue theorists are kind of similar. They differ in some aspects, but we're getting similar themes, right? Why is modern ethical philosophy incoherent? Well, because it uses concepts that make sense only within a divine law framework. And we've gotten rid of the divine, but we've kept the moral framework of divine command ethics, right? So once upon a time, for human beings, when we said morality, we meant this is what God commands us to do. But modern philosophy has taken God out of that equation. So there is no theological foundation for moral duties. And so this is the way she says it. Kantianism and utilitarianism tried to legislate morality, but there is no legislator. They both try to posit some external commanding force by which we can judge our actions, but there is nothing external. Without God, there is no external moral framework. Now, Anscombe was a devout Catholic, and so she argued that moral philosophy would make much more sense if it returned to a religiously grounded ethical framework, especially one rooted in divine law. But for the modern world, at a minimum, philosophers should at least stop developing moral theory based on rules, abstractions, obligations. Instead, she argues that we should revive virtue ethics drawing on Aristotle, right? So the alternative is to ground ethics in virtue, not law. It must abandon the rule-based system because rules don't make sense without a rule giver. See, right? Having a rules-based system doesn't make any sense unless you have some kind of external rule giver. And so we have to return to an account of, like an Aristotelian account of what makes humans happy, right? And so virtues like justice and temperance and courage and prudence are the proper foundation of ethics. And you see this with Aquinas, even within the Christian theological tradition, a move away from divine command ethics to a more virtue-based system where Aquinas talks about the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity and such. This should be the foundation of ethics, not some external framework by which we say, oh, I'm right if my behavior conforms to the rule or the hedonic calculus or whatever. So moral evaluation is about good versus bad human conduct. It's not about obedience to some set of abstract rules. Now, moral knowledge always begins with what we actually do in the world. In order to understand an action, you have to understand the context in which that action occurs. You have to understand, you have to ask this question, why did you do that? Like you could be standing on my foot, right? That in and of itself has no meaning. Like you step on my foot or you bump into me. That's just an action. It has no meaning. It has no inherent meaning. So in order to give that action meaning, I need to understand the context. I need to see, like, what are you trying to do? What did you intend? And only when I understand what you intended can I begin to understand the action itself. So it makes a difference. If you immediately turn to me and say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that, that's an entirely different context than if you look at me and say, yeah, I stepped on your foot. Now what are you going to do about it? So the action itself is meaningless. What matters is why. So our intentions always define the moral character of our actions. Our intentions are what we control. And without the intention, the action is meaningless. Without an intention, there can be no act to evaluate morally. An action can be morally wrong, even if it produces good results. We know this. If my intention was bad, if I intended to harm you, well, if in the unfolding of the action you are actually benefited, well, that wasn't my intention. So if I intended something impermissible, then that's a bad thing, right? Think about this. Two actions may look physically identical, but differ morally because the intentions are different. So if I give somebody a pill intending to relieve pain, or let's think about just the action. I give somebody a pill. That's meaningless. But if I'm intending to relieve their pain, then that's good. But what if I'm intending to kill them? Well, that's bad, right? So it's the intention that matters. It's the context. Without understanding the context, we can't understand the action. And so the outward act may be the same, but the moral character is different because the intention is different. The intention is actually determining what kind of action it is. So there are brute facts in the world, so physical events, but there are also institutional facts. And these are facts that only come to have meaning when we understand the framework of human practices, rules, or institutions. So understanding an action not only requires that we see the brute physical action, we also have to understand the institutional context that make the brute facts intelligible or meaningful. Why does this distinction matter? Because moral evaluation applies to institutional acts, not to just mere physical movements. Brute facts on their own are morally neutral. But when those same facts are situated within a social practice, then we can understand the intention, and then we can make a decision about whether those facts are good or bad. So, promising, lying, stealing, murdering, paying, or cheating all acquire moral significance, not because of the action itself, but because of the intention. And this is reflected in our criminal law, right? The distinction between actus reus and mens rea in the criminal law. So there has to be an act for there to be a crime. Okay, but the act itself is not enough. You shoot me. Is that a crime? Answer, it depends. What does it depend on? What was your mental state when you shot me? Was it a mistake? Did you not think the gun was loaded? That's not a crime. What if you're trying to kill me, though? See, intention matters, doesn't it? Intention matters. So without this distinction, Anscombe argues, we risk reducing moral judgment to mere consequences or physical outcomes. And again, that's the problem with utilitarianism. That's the problem with deontic ethics, right? Okay, Alistair McIntyre. McIntyre is huge. In virtue ethics and a theory called communitarianism. And we will look at communitarianism in a separate lecture. It's going to be a bonus lecture, but for those of you who are interested, Tim McIntyre is both a virtue ethicist and politically, he's a communitarian. And that's an interesting political view. It is an alternative, let me just tell you, it's an alternative to classical liberalism, this idea that the individual is everything. Communitarians believe it's the society that is more important. It's the community that is more important than the individual, or at least that the individual doesn't really develop outside the context of social relations. Okay, so McIntyre again, and you're seeing this theme, very critical of modern ethics. Why? Because and this is kind of funny, we abandon Aristotle. Again, right? These are all neo-Aristotelians. Where did we go wrong? When we abandoned Aristotle. So we should return to this kind of purpose-driven sense that Aristotle has. Human beings have a purpose, and their purpose is to exercise reason in a social context, right? McIntyre proposes a return to virtue ethics grounded in practice, the narrative unity of a life, and the authority of living traditions. Again, remember, he's a communitarian, and so social life, very important to our development as individuals, even. So Kantianism and utilitarianism tried to ground morality on universal reason. What's the problem with that? Well, it doesn't take into consideration the ultimate purpose of life. What's the purpose of life? See the problem? It's not just reasoning. Reason is a tool, not an end. What is the end of a good life? Again, what is the purpose of life? Happiness, flourishing, right? So ultimately, Kantianism failed, utilitarianism failed. What was left? Emotivism. Something is good just because I like it, or something is bad because I don't like it. There's no way you can create moral consensus when what is good is just what I like, or what is bad is what I don't like. That is no way to ground a society. That's not going to work. So morality can't arise from universal rules or subjective choices, but from the pursuit of goods internal to practices that enable individuals and communities to flourish. We have to start with the purpose. What is the purpose of human life? Flourishing, well-being, happiness. How do we get there from here? Virtue. Okay. To live ethically is to pursue the things that allow humans to thrive, not as individuals, but as part of a community. That's what human happiness is. Human happiness is us together living as a unified community. That's where McIntyre is coming from. In fact, we can only be ourselves in the context of our community. That's who we are. So tradition is big for McIntyre, just like with Confucius, right? Tradition was very important for Confucius. Tradition is very important for McIntyre. Why? Well, when we think about ethics, the way that we think about ethics is always embedded in some social tradition or some cultural tradition that we understand. I mean, we're all embedded in a culture, right? And every culture has its own way of thinking about right and wrong, or what is good for humans to do, or what is happiness. So when we think about ethics, the way that we think about ethics is embedded in some tradition. a historically extended, socially embodied argument about the good. Every culture has its own idea about the good. Now, those ideas overlap, but they're all fairly unique, right, in the way that they approach what is a good life. So traditions will shape our understanding of what is good, what is right, what is a virtue, what are our obligations, what is human flourishing. So rational disagreement is possible within a tradition, but not by appealing to some set of universal principles or abstract universal rules that are completely detached from context. That's not the way to go. Now, McIntyre says every social practice has its own set of traditions, its own history, and its own standards. And without understanding the larger context, the history, the standards, you can't understand right and wrong. You can't understand what virtue is. So and this is a really good example. Think about the practice of medicine. Okay, the practice of medicine is a tradition, right? It's kind of its own culture, and it has its own standards of right and wrong. And so the standards of right and wrong within the practice of medicine are determined by the purpose of medicine. What is the purpose of medicine? Health, flourishing of the patient. Great. How do we get there? Well, virtue. And within the medical practice, honesty is a virtue because good medical practice demands truthful communication. Without truthful communication between patient and doctor, it's very difficult to get to health and human flourishing. So we have to be transparent. Now, what's the point of this example? Honesty, the meaning of honesty can only be understood within the parameters of this cultural context, this historical context of medicine. So we can't talk about honesty in the abstract. We always have to put honesty in some particular context. And if we want to look at honesty in the context of medical practice, well, it's important. It's a virtue. Why? Because doctors and patients have to be honest with each other in order to reach the end of human flourishing. Great. Now, a problem arises. Sometimes external goods intrude upon a particular historical or social context. Now, to go back to the example of medicine, when external goods such as wealth and power take precedence over internal goods like honesty and transparency, the traditions that give virtues their meaning are displaced, and the virtues lose their moral point and corruption follows. So think about medicine. Imagine if medicine is redefined by an external good like profit. What does that do to the practice of medicine? And what does that do to the virtue of honesty in the context of medical practice? Well, in a purely market-driven, profit-maximizing framework, what counts as honesty could be distorted. In such a case, honesty might be downplayed to increase the bottom line. Honesty would just be another strategic tool for increasing revenue. And this is the problem for McIntyre. When external goods intrude upon, right, any kind of particular historical or social practice, like virtues can be distorted. All right. Capacity-based virtue ethics. This is very similar to what the Aristotelians are doing. But there's a shift in focus. The end is still human flourishing, but capacity-based virtue uh, ethical theorists want to focus more on how we develop our capacity for human flourishing. Like, what are the tools that we actually need to develop our capacity for human flourishing? And so this is still inspired by Aristotle's account of eudaimonia, but it's reframed in terms of substantive freedom all people need to live a full and dignified life. What do we need? What do we actually need to live a full life? Like, what do we need? Um, what do we need to achieve happiness? Now, the major figure here is Martha Nussbaum. And Nussbaum, very influential. Again, she is a kind of Aristotelian, right? Her ethics do like McIntyre or Foote. We're still thinking about what it takes for humans to be happy and to live a dignified, fully realized life. And so she draws inspiration from Aristotle, the Stoics, and contemporary psychology. And she argues that ethics must take seriously this question of capacity. What are the actual capacities people need in order to thrive? Okay, so what do human communities need in order for individuals to thrive in the context of that community? So justice and morality can't be measured purely by resources, utility, or formal rights, but rather by what people are actually able to do. Like, think about rights. It doesn't matter if you have rights if you don't have the capacity to exercise those rights. It doesn't matter if you have freedom if you don't have the capacity to exercise that freedom. It doesn't matter if you have autonomy if you don't have the capacity to exercise that autonomy. It doesn't matter, right? If you can't get there from here, then the abstract values and goals don't matter at all. What matters is, what can you actually do? And what can you actually become? And how do we create a society in which everyone has the capacity to achieve happiness? So virtues aren't just admirable traits, they are conditions for fully actualizing human potential. So the goal of society must be to create conditions in which everyone, every person can pursue a fully human life. And ask yourself this question: what would it take for you to flourish? Right? What do you need? Like, what is the minimum in order for you to live a life that you would say is a fully human life? A life of dignity, a life, where you controlled your destiny, where you were fulfilled, where you were happy. What would you actually need to do that? So we need to focus on bodily integrity, practical reason, emotional development, play, sociability, opportunities for self-expression. All of these things are virtues in the context of our capacity to develop a fully human life. Now, Nussbaum argues that the most important condition is autonomy, because that's what dignifies our life. That we control what our destiny, we control what we do, that we have freedom, and the freedom to choose and shape our own life So basic economic resources or legal rights, they're important, but they're insufficient on their own. What matters, can people truly function in ways that reflect their status as ends in themselves? That, remember, the kingdom of ends with Kant. Well, this is kind of similar to that. It's a different way to get there, but where everybody is an end in themselves, right? So human dignity becomes the moral foundation for evaluating social and political institutions, which must work to expand real opportunities to live a good life. How do you judge if a government is good? That government is expanding opportunities to live and achieve the type of life we want to live and achieve. Nussbaum argues that we must identify basic opportunities everyone is entitled to simply by virtue of being human. So that is something we all share. I mean, there are certain things we all, I don't know, maybe healthcare, the opportunity to exercise our autonomy and develop emotionally and cognitively, all of these things we need. But we also must create a broad space for cultural, religious, and individual diversity. Because no matter, like, yes, there is a human nature and there are certain things that are necessary to the cultivation of that nature, but how those capabilities are expressed will differ. All humans should have the capacity to pursue a fully human life, but different communities may realize these capacities in different ways. So again, this is not cultural relativism, but it is to embrace pluralism and diversity. Because different people will have different conceptions of what a good life is, right? So the goal is not to impose a single model of the good life, but to ensure that everyone has the genuine freedom to pursue their own version of what the good life actually is, of what flourishing actually is. Now, Amartya Sen is less known than Nussbaum, but very practical in his approach. He's an economist rather than a philosopher per se. And like Nussbaum, Sen uses a capacity approach to human flourishing, but he resists universal list of capabilities. Instead, he imagines a flexible, context-sensitive process in which capabilities are identified through discussion and cultural reasoning. Sen argues that we don't need a blueprint. We don't need some, fully fleshed out manifesto of values of what a good society is in order to make meaningful moral progress. So instead of, and we haven't got to political philosophy and social contract theory, but we'll talk about John Rawls. And Rawls creates a blueprint for political liberalism, for a liberal society. And Sen says we don't need to be that involved, with all the details. We should rather focus on comparative judgments. We should ask which social arrangements reduce injustice and expand people's actual freedom, and then double down on that. So justice becomes a process of eliminating oppression, not achieving moral purity. So we can just, as we progress through society, we can look at things that don't work or don't contribute to human flourishing, and we can get rid of those practices. And over time, we don't need a blueprint because a just society will just emerge from what we're doing. And after all, Sen argues that humans probably will never reach a consensus about what the perfect life is. And that's okay. because we can agree on what injustice, like we don't know what an ideal society would look like. But you know what? We know dystopias when we see them. Maybe you think that Norway is great or that this country is great or whatever, but people don't agree on that. But no, everybody agrees you don't want to live in North Korea. You don't want to live under complete anarchy. So there are certain things that we can all agree on we should avoid. We can agree on undeniable injustices, poverty, sickness, disease, war. Those things should be avoided. And there's universal agreement about that. And so we should be humble and see justice as a continuous cooperative project. And it's always kind of deferred. We never get to perfection, but we're just making incremental advancements. And that's okay. That's good enough. We don't wait for the ideal theory to appear. We look at real lives, real harms, real detriments, and real opportunities. Then we act where we can act, and we make improvements where we can make improvements in those places that are obvious and urgent. And through this process, we get a better society. Agent-based virtue theory. Okay, this grounds morality in our motives and our emotional dispositions. We judge actions solely by what they reveal about our character. Are we a good person or are we a bad person? Rather than we don't have rules, we don't have consequences, we don't have a moral calculus, hedonic calculus, or categorical imperative, or this abstract idea of human flourishing. It's nothing like here. Yeah, even the concept of human flourishing, as Sen kind of points out, can be so reified and abstract that it's useless. So let's just look at character. And here we have Michael Sloat, and he rejects rule-based moral theories and consequentialism. No surprise. Sloat argues that the core moral virtue is empathy. Now, there's a lot of controversy right now. People are saying, well, empathy is overrated or empathy is not good. Sloat disagrees. Empathy is the key moral concern. A psychologically grounded capacity to respond appropriately to the needs and feelings of others. This is what makes us human. This is the definitive characteristic of being human. How do we respond to the needs of other people? And this is the sole criteria that we use to determine if we're good or we're bad. That's interesting. For Sloat, actions are good when they express sufficient empathy and they are morally deficient when they reflect callousness, indifference, or excessive self-absorption. You know what? Yeah, indifference, cruelty, callousness, those aren't good, folks. And no matter how many kind of machinations and you try, no, you're not a good person if you are indifferent or self-absorbed. Okay? Stop trying to pretend like you can make that happen. It's not a thing. Okay, so Sloat gives this example. You're a professor and you have two students. One student asks for an extension on an assignment because they procrastinated. They just ignored the deadline. The other student asked for an extension because their parent has just been hospitalized and they're overwhelmed. Sloat says the answer to this problem is simple. You grant the extension to the second student, but not the first. Oh my God, Kant is rolling over in his grave. But the answer is simple, isn't it? The moral quality of your action depends on empathic concern, not on whether it follows a universal rule or maximizes utility. Your response reflects who you are, a genuine sensitivity to your students' distress and vulnerability. Look, denying the extension to the first student isn't callousness. Granting the extension would be indulgence. Granting it to the second student, however, does express a morally admirable motive, care for another person's stuff. Look, the context is different. The situations are different. So the responses should be different. And importantly, Sloat denies that morality is always overriding or impartial. Partiality towards family and close relationships is morally legitimate. Empathy naturally varies with proximity and intimacy. Of course, we care for our families more than we care for strangers. Stop pretending like you care as much for strangers as you do the people that you know and you love. You don't. No one does. So why should we create a moral system that doesn't recognize that fact? Okay, Neo-Confucianism, contemporary Confucian virtue ethics. I shouldn't say Neo-Confucianism because that refers to an older school of classical Confucius scholars after Confucius, but contemporary Confucian virtue ethics. This reinterprets classical Confucian ideas of moral self-cultivation, relational personhood, and ritual practice for modern philosophical contexts. And not surprisingly, we remember what we talked about with Confucius. The Confucians emphasized that virtues don't emerge from abstract principles, but rather from cultivating one's character within the web of family relationships, community, and social roles, guided by practices such as reflection, empathy, and ritual propriety. Okay, so here you see the continuity back to original Confucianism, the respect for ritual and tradition. Confucianism sees the self as fundamentally relational, not individualistic. A person will flourish then when they can harmonize their emotions, desires, and conduct within the broader moral cosmos. So it's not just about you. Not just about you. Okay. Tu Wei Ming. He gives a modern humanistic reinterpretation of Confucianism. And this emphasizes moral self-cultivation, relational personhood, and the spiritual depth of ordinary ethical life. He argues that the Confucian self is not an autonomous, isolated individual, but rather a relational self, a social self. And this is a more robust, a deeper understanding of what a person is. The self is constituted through family, community, ritual, and shared practices. It doesn't make any sense to think about the individuated self, the self that is cut off from everything else. That's a reification. That's an abstraction. What you need to think about is the self that emerges from this web of or context of interpersonal relationships. So while traditional Confucianism is embedded in Chinese history, language, and institutions, here Wei Ming argues for a universal Confucianism, Confucian humanism. And this is not just about Chinese culture and not just about Chinese history and tradition and ritual. It's a global moral resource. So he has engaged with Western philosophy, Kant, Heidegger, Charles Taylor. He sees Confucianism as part of world history, not just Chinese history. So Tu rejects the idea that Confucianism is incompatible with modernity. No, not at all. The emphasis on empathy and responsibility and self-transformation is a corrective to this problem of individualism and instrumental rationality. And you could see this is endemic in Western nations. This idea, and look, we talk about political liberalism and humanism and the idea, the celebration of the individual and freedom and autonomy, and that's great, but you can take it too far. And I think that Wei Ming and many other contemporary philosophers have said that this idea, and the communitarians, this idea of the individuated person completely cut off and separated from the community is a lie. So while affirming universal moral aspirations such as human dignity, mutual respect, Wei Ming insists that these must be realized through culturally embedded practices rather than thin procedural principles. Again, morality is embedded. It's embedded in traditions. It's embedded in cultures. Yes, there can be universal principles that apply to everyone, but those principles will be shaped and understood through a particular point of view, cultural point of view. Ethical responsibility, on his view, radiates outward in concentric circles. I love this idea of radiating circles outward, of our moral obligations and connections. Self, family, society, humanity, and ultimately the natural world, the cosmos itself. We're embedded in all of these circles, right? So this makes Confucian ethics both particular in method and universal in moral concern. Okay, what are some of the criticisms of virtue ethics, just contemporary virtue ethics, and again, specifically virtue ethics in general? Because there are no formal principles or maxims, there's a lack of guidance. Critics argue that virtue ethics tells us what kind of person to be, but not what to do in specific moral dilemmas. That's actually true. And the virtue ethicist will say, well, specific moral dilemmas are complex and unfold in real time without time for reflection. However, it's a pretty good point. We don't get specific advice about what to do. We're just supposed to figure it out. Saying act courageously or do what a virtuous person would do can seem very vague or even worse, circular, a type of circular logic. Virtue ethics seems relativistic at times. Virtue ethics often grounds virtue in social practices or traditions, but different cultures valorize different traits. Example, honor, obedience, independence. This creates the risk of moral relativism or an uncritical conservatism, like we see in some of the critiques of Confucianism. of ancient Confucianism, too conservative. It could even legitimize oppressive traditions, hierarchy, patriarchy, things like that. And so that's a problem. The problem of moral luck, and we talked about this last time. Virtue ethics emphasizes character formation, but let's be realistic. How is character shaped? Upbringing, social conditions, economics, poverty. How much of that is luck? Holding people morally responsible for traits beyond their control seems unfair. Shouldn't we be judged only for what is actually under our control? Somebody with a naturally compassionate temperament will find it easier to be moral than somebody with a cruel inclination. Okay, so you were born Gandhi. Good for you. You love the world. I don't. So isn't it a lot harder for me to be compassionate? Isn't that just a matter of luck? Interesting objection. Situationism. Ethical situationists maintain that behavior is influenced less by character and more by the particular circumstances of a situation. Lots of psychological experiments, folks. For example, people who find $1 on the ground are much more likely to behave altruistically. Like later, if they find somebody's wallet, they are much more likely to give it back. Why? Not because of any particular character trait, but because of situational influence. What about rights and justice? You know, virtue ethics minimizes questions of justice and questions of rights, kind of in the same way that utilitarianism did. Virtue ethics focuses on moral excellence rather than rights or fair procedures or institutional justice. As a result, rights are often treated as derivative rather than foundational. So rights are less important than character traits. Similarly, justice is not primarily a system of impartial procedures or entitlements, as in political liberalism, but one virtue among others shaped by social practices and social context. So the importance of rights is diminished in virtue ethics. Finally, critics argue that without a strong, independent account of rights and justice, virtue ethics may struggle to criticize unjust social structures or protect the vulnerable. And again, this is similar to the critique of moral relativism. Okay, so without any external sense of justice or rights, well, maybe anything goes. Okay, now the virtue ethicists will disagree with that, but again, we're talking about criticisms. Well, all right, that's virtue ethics. So we saw Aristotle and Confucius, and we talked about Epicurus and the Cynics, like Diogenes, and then finally the Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca. So we talked about all of those figures, and today we talked about contemporary virtue ethics. That's it for virtue ethics. Yeah, a lot of stuff. Now we're going to see, a few more topics, and we're going to get into application of of into particular problems and particular dilemmas that come up. And I do thank you for sharing this time with me, and I thank you for your patience. And I will see all of you on Thursday. And again, thank you guys so much. And I hope that you enjoyed this.